On to our next guest, and I'm really pleased to have been able to chat with Dr. Christy Huff. Dr. Huff is a cardiologist who resides in Fort Worth, Texas. She attended medical school at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School and completed an internal medicine residency at Washington University in 2004. She was in private practice as a cardiologist in Fort Worth from 2008 to 2011, and following the birth of her child, she made the decision to become a stay-at-home mom. Dr. Huff has personal experience of benzodiazepine withdrawal, and she's dedicated significant time to advocate for better education of physicians regarding the dangers of benzodiazepines, how to safely taper patients off the drugs, and stronger regulation of the prescribing of benzodiazepines. She is a director of the Benzodiazepine Information Coalition. Dr. Huff, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me for the Mad in America podcast. And to begin, to kind of get started, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and, in particular, how it was that you first came to be prescribed a benzodiazepine.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on the show, James. So, benzodiazepines, I actually took them very occasionally for flying for years. Never had a problem with them. The real problem started back in August of 2015 when I began to take them on a daily basis. I had a painful case of dry eye syndrome. It was so painful I couldn't sleep. So I was prescribed what was considered to be a low dose of Xanax to take up to 3 times daily as needed. And I only took 1/4 milligram nightly, trying to take as little as possible just to help me sleep while we were trying to sort out the eye problem. So the medication did help me sleep for a couple of weeks, but about 3 weeks in, really strange things started to happen. I first had some anxiety during the day, and I just thought that was related to the medical crisis I was experiencing. And then I developed a tremor, and I started to think I had some type of neurological condition that somehow tied into the dry eye syndrome. So I went to many different specialists, and I had a lot of expensive testing done. And nobody really ever mentioned during that time that Xanax could be the problem. And while I was undergoing evaluation, I just kept getting more and more sick with more symptoms. I began having trouble breathing, trouble swallowing. I would wake up 3 hours after going to sleep in a blind panic. My heart was racing. And by this time, I had the Xanax on an as-needed basis, so I was taking it several times a day just to help out with these symptoms. And I thought I was treating the anxiety I was having. So, all the medical testing came back normal. And so my doctors just assumed this was psychological. So I was referred for a biofeedback session. And the psychologist asked me to hold my Xanax dose for 12 hours so it wouldn't interfere with the session. And I ended up completing the session, but I began to get ill during the session. I ended up lying on the floor of her office. And all my muscles were severely contracted. I couldn't breathe. And I took my dose of Xanax, and these symptoms just melted away. So right there, that was my aha moment that Xanax was causing the illness. So I got home and I got on the computer. I Googled and I discovered the website Benzo Buddies, which is a web forum for people withdrawing from benzodiazepines. And that confirmed my suspicions. So basically, I had become physically dependent on the drug. And I was experiencing interdose withdrawal, which are basically withdrawal symptoms that occur between scheduled doses. And that can occur with any benzodiazepine, but especially more with the short-acting benzos like Xanax.
And obviously, Christy, being a physician yourself, when you kind of found this information that it was probably a dependence problem, did that make sense to you straight away, or did your medical training cause you to kind of question that and think, well, is it the drugs or is it not the drugs, or did it really click into place when you kind of found that?
Well, I think when I got on the internet and I found that out, I mean, it just clicked because everything that they were describing online completely fit. So it was obvious and there was no denying it. But I will say it wasn't on my radar screen coming into it because that wasn't something we had really been taught in medical school. We were taught more about addictive properties of the drug.
And so, you got to a place where obviously you've worked out that it's withdrawal and dependency causing your issues. So did you kind of decide then to start to come off the benzodiazepines, or did you wait before you started to come off? So what happened next?
So as soon as I discovered that was the problem, I knew that I had to come off because I was so sick. So I needed to get off this drug immediately.
So, Christy, could you share with me, how did you actually approach your taper? How did you go about reducing?
Sure. So I was able to stabilize at 15 milligrams of Valium. And then initially, after all my research, I decided to follow the protocol that was delineated in the Ashton manual. So I cut 1 milligram from my dose, and I was basically plunged in the pits of hell with withdrawal symptoms with that. So that was obviously too large of a reduction for me. And so I found that pretty quickly. I was going to have to go quite a bit slower than the protocol that she delineated. So I slowed my cuts down to 0.5 milligram at a time, and I would hold those anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, depending on how I was doing. And I was able to use this traditional cut and hold method till about halfway through my taper. And at that point, the symptoms just got too severe for me to handle with those larger cuts. So I did further research on the online forums, and I opted to do micro tapering with a gram scale. So what I would do is weigh my pills, and I would shave them with a nail file, and that would allow me to make micro reductions in my daily dose. And that worked well for me for the last half of the taper. It didn't completely take all of the withdrawal symptoms away, but it definitely was a lot smoother of a process and a lot easier to control how fast you were going than that traditional cut and hold method.
Yeah. And so was there a kind of variable time between making one cut and the next, or did you aim for a fixed time, or did you just kind of let your body dictate when you were ready for the next reduction?
I really just let my body dictate it. It was all based on how I was feeling and what I felt like I could handle. And so really, as I was going along through the taper, I never really had an end date because I just didn't know how long it was going to take.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you remember how you felt the day after the first day you didn't take a tablet?
I do, because it wasn't so long ago. Honestly, I was terrified about what was about to happen to me because I didn't, you hear all these stories online that people, after they quote jump off their dose, that it gets so much worse. And I would say that I jumped at a dose of 0.175 milligrams of Valium, which Ashton recommends jumping at 0.5 milligrams. So I tapered quite a bit lower. There's some people that even taper all the way to 0. Using the scale method, it's harder to get a smaller to taper all the way down to 0. I would say that it just felt like cuts that I had experienced in the past. It really wasn't any worse than anything else I had experienced in my taper previously.
Thank you, Christy. And you kind of mentioned there that as part of your withdrawal, you changed from what I think was a kind of short-acting benzodiazepine to a longer-acting form. And I just wondered how that helps with the withdrawal process.
Sure. So I did this based on the recommendations in the Ashton manual, which is a withdrawal guide for benzodiazepines, which had been written by Heather Ashton. She ran a benzo withdrawal clinic in the UK in the 80s and 90s. And so her premise is that a long-acting benzodiazepine will be easier to taper, specifically Valium, for a couple of reasons. First is the lower potency of Valium, so you're able to make smaller dosage reductions with a cuts than, say, if you were trying to reduce from something like Xanax or Ativan. And then also the longer half-life itself makes it an advantage because you're getting less peaks and valleys in the drug levels, and therefore less peaks and valleys in your symptoms. And I definitely say it helped in my case because it covered that interdose withdrawal symptoms that I was having with the Xanax. And then I was able to stabilize on a dose of Valium and then taper down from there.
And did you have any issues kind of transferring between them? I know that some do and some don't.
I think for me, my interdose withdrawal symptoms from Xanax were so horrible, so violent, that Valium was almost like this gift. It took those hours where I was just sitting there gasping for air, unable to breathe, my muscles all contracted down. It took that part away. And then I was able to make slower, smaller reductions with the Valium and, ultimately be successful on the taper.
I'm guessing, people that I've spoken with that have endured withdrawal talk about how it affects not just them, but their family too. And obviously you're a mother. So, were these kind of issues that you were experiencing affecting your family life too?
Oh, yes, it was terrible. So my daughter was 4 when all this started. She was in preschool, and I'm married as well. And it completely obliterated my ability to be a mother because I was so incredibly ill. For the first 2 years of my taper, I needed to hire a nanny to help me because I couldn't do my basic responsibilities, managing the household, driving, caring for my daughter. As you name it, I couldn't do it.
Yeah, it's a common experience, I think, that I've found from others, that it's not just dealing with the withdrawal, is it? It's trying to live your everyday life and trying to participate in all the things that you need to do while you're suffering these horrendous symptoms. And as you said earlier, trying to manage it all yourself with little or no medical kind of input.
Exactly. Yeah, and I was bedridden many days, so it's really hard to be a parent in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I've read in some of your writing, some of your blogs, Christy, that overlapping with your issues with benzodiazepine tolerance and withdrawal, you unfortunately also experienced breast cancer treatment. So, I wondered how did the benzodiazepine, taking that or trying to come off it, how did that go along with having breast cancer treatment? Did they affect each other?
Yes, it definitely did. So I had started my taper in January of 2016. So it was a number of months before I was able to find some medical help and get switched over to Valium and start my taper. A few months later, in April of 2016, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I was already down almost 5 milligrams of Valium in my taper at the time of diagnosis. And this was an incredibly dark time for me. I would say that going through both cancer and benzodiazepine withdrawal at the same time is really its own special version of hell. Many cancer patients, they are put on anti-anxiety drugs after diagnosis to help deal with it, but I had to face all this fear and terror while tapering off an anti-anxiety drug. And honestly, I don't know how I made it through. As far as how it affected my treatments, I needed 2 surgeries for the cancer. And of course, this delayed my taper because I had to hold my dose 6 weeks prior to the surgery to be good and stable to go into the operating room. And then after surgery, a couple of weeks after the anesthesia wore off on both occasions, it sent me into withdrawals, even though I hadn't changed my Valium dose. And so I had to hold on the back end of the surgeries as well to help me to stabilize again and aid in my recovery. Another thing that happened is my pain wasn't adequately treated because I had a lot of muscle spasms in my chest. And the surgeon's typical treatment for that was Valium, at least for the first week. And obviously, the Valium wasn't doing a whole lot for me besides just keeping me out of withdrawal. So I spent months just hunched over in pain, and I had to go to physical therapy. And then one other awful side effect has been that, I have a lot of random aches and pains, some quite severe in benzodiazepine withdrawal. And, my oncologist has told me, if you have any new or different pain than your normal, then you need to get that evaluated if it's lasting more than 2 weeks. Now, of course, with benzo withdrawal, everything hurts all the time and new things do crop up. So I've had to go to the scanner more than once to get that checked out, and just the terror of waiting for that scan, waiting for the results. I can't even describe it. Luckily, everything has turned out clear every time, but it's still just an unfortunate side effect that I have to go through that fear every time.
Yeah, absolutely. Christy, I can't imagine how much anxiety and terror you must have faced going through all that together. And, I think many people probably would have not continued with their taper, maybe would have stayed where they are given the challenge that they were facing. But I think you finished your taper on March 15th this year, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, which I think is incredibly well done, to manage all that and still continue your journey. And as someone on that journey myself, I know that's no small thing at all. So I just wonder, how long was your tapering process in total? And now a few months out from coming off completely, how have things been for you?
The taper itself, of course, it took me a few months to find someone to help me and then get transitioned over to Valium. Once I started tapering the Valium itself, that lasted 3 years and almost 3 months. Now, there was a little bit of delay in the taper, like I mentioned, because of the cancer surgeries. Otherwise, that's how long it took, and I really don't think I could have gone any faster and remained at least somewhat functional for my daughter. And during the taper, I was pretty disabled. I experienced up to 80 different withdrawal symptoms. It was incredibly rough. I would say that, so I'm about 4 months out from the taper at this point, and I'm doing quite a bit better in many ways, but I still have a really long ways to go. But I can tell that I've probably about the 2-month mark, I started to have off the drug. I started to have my energy level returning and my head's becoming clearer, and I'm able to just do more things and get outside the house. But I still have bad days. I still wake up in the mornings with that jolt of terror. And so we've got a ways to go, but I'm optimistic that I will recover in time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as I say, I think it's a magnificent achievement to come off in the way that you did. And I just wondered, Christy, it might be difficult to answer this, but personally myself, I'm still on the journey, but I do have anxiety about, not just will I be able to get off, but if I do get off, will I still be the same person?
Right.
The other side of the drugs. And I just wondered, were you so fixed on getting off that it was a success for you, or did you have that anxiety about what will be left for me once I've gone past the drugs?
There was definitely anxiety all the way down, just because I was so sick and I really didn't know if I would ever get better. But, for me, I knew that I had to get off because the drugs were just flat out making me sick. And so I just told myself staying on is not an option. You have to get off if you are going to ever even have a shot at getting better. And so I just looked at it that way, and I stuck with it the whole way. And, now that's finally starting to pay off after all these years. And I do feel like that I'm getting myself back. And I even felt that, small changes in my personality, even, getting towards the end of my taper and under the 5 milligram mark of Valium, I could really feel that my personality was returning. So the drug had been blunting who I was at the higher doses.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm grateful to you for sharing this story, because I think there's still this conception, certainly here in the UK, probably in the US too, that a taper is something that someone does over a few weeks or at most a couple of months. Whereas I've spoken to many people, and myself is true, a taper for me has been 2 years so far. So I think medicine has a long way to go, doesn't it, to recognize that tapering off these drugs is a multi-year process for a good number of people.
I agree. And, we were definitely taught in medicine that it just takes a couple of months. It doesn't take that long. And that's not the case at all. And honestly, if I had known how long this process was going to take, I would have never touched that drug.
And so, we're kind of coming on nicely there to, obviously you're a physician yourself, and now you work with the Benzodiazepine Information Coalition and write for them. So I just wondered, as a physician, why you feel it's important to speak out about your experiences.
Sure. So I will say that the more I experienced this hell, and then I was reading what others in the online groups were facing, and then I started talking to these people and hearing their stories, it just became clear that this is a huge problem, that withdrawal from benzodiazepines being so severe and so disabling and taking so long. And really what it's creating is a neurological injury. And, I thought if I didn't know about this epidemic going on, most doctors didn't either. So I decided to share my story openly. And, one of the sad things to me is that it does seem my story seems to carry more weight because I am a physician. Which means, we really haven't been listening to the patients all these years, because, the bottom line is patients have known what's happening to them for years with these benzodiazepines, and they're there have been multiple attempts to get the governments and medical professionals to listen as far as back as the 1970s. And yet we're still ignoring patients. So, I don't think this is right. And the big reason I've stood up about this is I just can't stand by and watch without speaking up.
I recognize what you say about, withdrawal doesn't discriminate, does it? It doesn't really matter whether you're a physician or just a regular person or a psychiatrist or a doctor or whatever else. And I think it's so powerful for everybody to speak out, but physicians speaking out does legitimize what patient experiences are saying too. So, I'm really grateful for all medics who, do share their own experiences about the reality of trying to come off these drugs.
Yes. And I wish there were more of us speaking out, because they exist, but many cannot speak out because their jobs might be in danger.
Yeah, absolutely. And, turning to kind of online kind of support, which you mentioned earlier, Christy, you've blogged about some of the online benzodiazepine withdrawal communities of which you're part. And I just wanted, in your opinion, why it is that benzodiazepine patients are turning to the internet for advice instead of their doctors.
So the simple answer, it's out of necessity, because medical professionals, as I found out, we're uneducated about the problem. And there's really no other avenue besides the internet to obtain knowledge and support. So what we have is a group of people who have been forced to get on the internet to self-diagnose their benzodiazepine as being their problem. And then they have to get advice from total strangers how to taper off the drug, and also rely on these strangers. And these strangers are also very sick themselves, rely on them for emotional support. And, if this sounds insane, this is really our only option at the moment. I had to do it too. And, random strangers on the internet saved my life.
I kind of feel for myself that if I'm lucky, I might get 5 minutes or 10 minutes with a doctor, but withdrawal is a 24-hour thing, isn't it? So sometimes
Yes.
I've needed some support in the middle of the night or in the early hours of the morning when I can't sleep and I'm consumed with symptoms. So I personally think the support communities are an absolutely vital piece of kind of responding to this challenge of benzodiazepine-induced injury.
Yes, definitely.
So turning then to some of your work as director of the Benzodiazepine Information Coalition, some of it's focused around assisting people in the US with reporting their adverse experiences to the FDA MedWatch program. So, I just wonder what was the importance of reporting these kind of events to the regulatory bodies, the FDA in the US or other regulators in other countries?
This is something that's near and dear to my heart. And I just really think it's so important. If you've had an adverse drug event, you need to report that to the FDA. Or if you're in another country, you should have a similar agent or similar agency. And I know some people say this seems futile or they don't trust the government, but the bottom line is if you don't report it, then it didn't happen. So I like to tell people to think of the FDA MedWatch program as a giant database. So it's basically collecting new information all the time. So you're adding your data to that database when you file a report. And eventually we'll be able to go back and use that information to help connect all the dots of what's going on. Just a little background, there was a failed citizens petition to our FDA in 2010 asking for stronger warning labels and even a black box warning on benzodiazepines. And we'd like to repetition the FDA about this issue. And if we can get more evidence in the form of these FDA MedWatch reports and also research, then that will really help our cause along. And, I'd specifically like to see people that have experienced severe reactions to these drugs to file reports. So specifically, if you've had a severe withdrawal experience or a protracted withdrawal or attempted or completed suicide, then reporting those events will really go a long way. And, everyone always asks us what they can do to help. And filing a report is the first thing I tell anyone that they could and should do. And anybody can fill it out for you. You can, your doctor, your family, a friend. We also have volunteers at BIC that are available to help file reports for people that can't do it for themselves. And if you'd like to find a link and some information about filling it out and some instructions, please visit our website at benzoinfo.com.
That's great. Thank you. And that's so important, isn't it? Because it's kind of down to us who've experienced it to provide the evidence base for this in the hope that then there's some leverage for the regulators to react.
Exactly.
And also, I note that you've been involved in some research, particularly around conducting a benzodiazepine withdrawal survey. So I just wondered if you could share some of that with us.
Sure. So I was approached over a year ago by Jane McCoubry. She's a PhD in communications studies, and she wanted to design a survey to document benzodiazepine withdrawal symptoms in the online community. So she designed a survey with my input, and we placed that in the online communities. And we had over 1,200 respondents, and 98% of these had taken their benzodiazepines as prescribed. So this was basically the compliant patient population, not people who had misused the drugs. And we're in the very preliminary phases of the study, but I can share a few things with you. We collected a lot of information on symptoms and how long they lasted. And, just as an example, people had experienced symptoms over a year. 67% had reported ongoing anxiety, fear, and nervousness. And 45% had continuing memory problems. 20% had akathisia, which is a need to move or pace constantly and can be a very severe symptom for many people. 24% had violent thoughts against others. 55% considered or attempted suicide. And these are symptoms, again, that had lasted a year or more. And I think what's more telling than just a list of symptoms is talking about the outcomes, or what are the effects of these symptoms. And, 46% had lost a job, 27% lost their savings, 40% had increased medical costs, 50% said work life was an enormous problem. So it just affects all aspects of your life, basically. Additional analysis is underway, and we'll be able to split all this data into different subgroups and kind of see which patterns emerge. And we're hoping to publish some scientific papers and really get this information out there about how severe withdrawal really is.
Fantastic. I'm so glad to hear that work is going on, because, I'm sure you know yourself, if you look for papers on withdrawal effects from not just benzodiazepines, but antidepressants and maybe neuroleptics too, then it's really hard to find anything that doesn't play down the experience into a kind of very mild, minor annoyance for a few weeks for people. And yet these kind of patient-populated surveys are showing the true horror and the full extent of the problem, aren't they?
Yes, it is.
Thank you, Dr. Huff. That was really interesting, and I'm so grateful to get to chat. And also, I wanted to thank you for all of your work in speaking out and advocating, and all the work that you do with Benzodiazepine Information Coalition, because we need so much more of that, and we need so many more like you. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, James. It was a pleasure to be on your show today.
So thank you for listening today, and thank you also to our guests Janelle and Dr. Christy Huff. And please listen in to the second part of this podcast, where we chat with addiction specialist and medical consultant to the Alliance for Benzodiazepine Best Practices, Dr. Stephen Wright.